Next up, we're going to take the clutch off. 10mm 12-point socket required. After this, we'll take the flywheel out and get it resurfaced. This is the 1.7-liter Non VVT engine, I guess. Okay, we've installed the resurfaced flywheel and the new clutch plate. It's pretty cool. The clutch came with the alignment tool, the pilot bushing, and also a throwout bearing. So for what price we got all of that done. It's installed and torqued down. The flywheel bolts were 87 foot-pounds and the clutch bolts were 19 foot-pounds. We have the transmission up on a table here, supported by some wood blocks. Just as part of maintenance, I'm using my long neck hooker to pull these seals out. There's another seal on the back side. I'm going to replace these two seals. They're cheap, and while I'm in here I might as well do it. First thing we need to do is remove the clutch throwout bearing. So there's a couple of springs. You can see the spring hidden back here. So you have to just squeeze the spring, slip the clutch throwout bearing over that ball, and it'll slide off the front. I'm probably going to replace this bearing as well while I'm in here. And we'll go from there, and then we'll flip it up. We're going to flip it up on its on this surface, on these wood blocks, and then start working on the back of the transmission. Right, we used our long neck hooker to release this spring from inside the clutch throwout bearing. So these humps used to sit in there. Release the top, release the bottom. The whole bearing then can be slid off. Bearing comes off, it slides onto. It actually sits on these. There's grooves you can see in the back. They actually slide over the this arm, so you can take the bearing off. Actually, it doesn't seem like there's really anything wrong with that, but still probably replace it, because if something does go wrong later, I don't have to do this all again. Okay, transmission is flipped up. Shaft is down and not touching the table. I put the gear selector in neutral. We are going to remove the transmission hanger, this detents, shift detents, and the backup light switch first. So I guess when these come out, there's going to be springs and balls in the back of these. And this is just an electrical switch, which might have an O-ring behind it, and a simple bracket here. This backup light switch, it requires a 27mm socket. Next up, we're going to remove the shift mechanism. It looks like there's 4 bolts here. 1, 2, 3. I already started taking that off. 4. These are 10mm bolts. Next up, we're going to take the 2 drain plugs, or the fill and drain plugs out, and the vehicle speed sensor. Next step is to loosen the case mounting bolts. There's a number of these. These were 12mm bolts. Looks like there's some places you might be able to do some prying to break the case apart. All the housing bolts are removed, and now we need to release this snap ring, and I guess pull it up out of the groove, and that will allow the case to be removed. The snap ring doesn't come out of the groove like the service manual says. It just has to be held open while the case is removed. So I used a pry bar on this pry point to break the case open, and a pry bar on this mount point, or this prying point, to break the case open. And now I'm going to have an extra set of hands hold this snap ring open while I lift the case up. Transmission case is split in half now. You can see the snap ring down inside of the opening there, right here. Let's see if I can get to it. There it is. This is the snap ring that needed to be opened in order for the case to be removed. So I had a friend hold that snap ring open while I pried the case away. And just with a little bit of persistence, the case will open right up. Next up, we are going to remove the reverse idler gear and shaft, and then we're going to take these 2 bolts off and remove this mechanism. these two bolts. They look like 10 millimeter. Take this off, and then the entire main shaft and the counter shaft assembly will lift out. Then the diff lifts out, and then we should be able to see the input shaft bearing where we remove the mechanism, the reverse idler gear, and also applied some tape to the spline shaft down inside of the transmission. This is supposed to protect the seal. Now, this whole mechanism will just lift out. The two shaft assemblies lifted out pretty easily. We'll just have to make sure that we keep the gears mated up properly when we reinstall it. There were two washers here. I also spun the bearing already, and you can feel it grinding, so it's definitely needs to be replaced. We got the bearing out. Actually wasn't so bad at all. I tool loaned this slide hammer kit from AutoZone. The two-jaw fixture wouldn't work because the two arms would not fit opposite each other inside the bearing. But using just two of the three jaw pullers, I could squeeze the two arms enough, and then once they were in there, I held them open with one hand, and with about 3 slides of the hammer, the bearing actually came out. It pulled the seal out, but I would want to replace this anyways. Last note here, this bearing, the ball bearings were down. To save any headaches later, I actually just took some zip ties and zip tied this mechanism together. Maybe it'll make it easier to install. Okay. We have reinstalled the shaft assembly that I had zip tied. That worked out pretty well. Kept the washers in place. Before that, I banged in a new input shaft seal and a bearing. I actually froze the input shaft bearing. Pounded in really easily with a drift set right here that I got from Harbor Freight for like, I don't know, 15 bucks. And then installed the reverse gear selector and reverse shift fork, the idler gear, the drip tray, cleaned the surfaces again with brake cleaner, and then applied black RTV. And now the case is put back together. When you reinstall the case, you have to open up the snap ring, and then I used a rubber mallet to tap around the case to kind of get it seated, and banged here a couple times, and eventually the snap ring clicked into place, which was good. So now the RTV instructions say to let it sit for about an hour and then torque it down. So it's finger tight. It's finger tight plus a little bit. I'm going to let it tack up, and then I'll torque it down to the spec. It's been almost an hour since we sealed the transmission, so I'm going to torque these bolts to 20, and then I don't know what the torque is on the shift mechanism bolts, but we'll snug those down, and we'll probably